Chapter 12. The True History of Theophilus Toad. 1 week later, Toad was sitting opposite the heron, waiting to begin his narrative. He was feeling quite excited because he realized that never again would he have the opportunity to recount his complete life story to an attentive audience. "Where should I begin?" he asked. "Wherever you like," replied Heron. "Well, my earliest memory is sitting on the sand under an umbrella, feeling sad. We always went on holiday to Cornwall, where we had a large dark house called Moss Terrace. You went upstairs to get to it, and had a wonderful view over the harbour, but it was always an unhappy time. My father only came down at the weekends, and, as an only child, I was alone with my nanny and my mother. Mother was always so busy that I spent a great deal of my time on my own, feeling sad." "But what about the rest of your family?" asked Heron. "If you want me to start right at the beginning, then I have to begin with my paternal grandfather, Cornelius. He started the old Abbey Brewery, which is brewing to this day. Unfortunately, it is now owned by the National Beer Company and makes lager. Ugh. He was, I suppose, typical of his generation, hard-working, paternalistic to his employees, and very moralistic to his family. My father told me that in those days every man received a turkey at Christmas and 2 pints of beer every lunchtime. I remember as a very small person being taken around the brewery offices by grandfather and being addressed as Young Master Toad. I also remember him pointing to me and saying to the head clerk, 'Here's the future chairman.' I felt scared." "Why was that?" asked Heron. "Because even then I knew I did not want to work there." "Why?" "Because I was frightened of grandfather. He was big physically, and I could feel that he was very powerful. He lived in a large house in the village, but we lived at Toad Hall. You can't imagine what it was like, visiting him and grandmother at the hall. There were maids and servants and cooks and an army of gardeners, and once a year at the regatta, the house was full of visitors for days at a time. One year, I was told, the prince and princess arrived by boat, and there was a wonderful lunch on the lawn, but I'm afraid it's not half so grand now." Toad stopped after a large tear rolled down his cheek. After a pause, Heron spoke. "What about your father?" he asked. Toad blew his nose and then continued. "I always felt that my father would have liked me to be more like grandfather than he actually was, so I think it made him stricter and more autocratic towards me. When I think of him now, and he's been dead these past 20 years, I can still feel his disapproval. I was never the Toad he wanted me to be. Thomas, my father, was hard-working and achieving and driven by the Protestant work ethic. I think he always felt the burden of inheriting not only the brewery but also the position of chief executive. This was especially true when grandfather retired but remained chairman. I'm sure that father felt, although he was managing director, that he was standing in grandfather's shadow and he had to prove himself in everything he did." "So how do you remember him?" asked Heron. "As stern and disapproving. I always wanted his love and attention but never got it. One of my mother's recurring phrases was, 'Not now, Theo.' My Christian name is Theophilus, although not many people know this. 'Can't you see that father is busy?' Father had a way of saying, 'Theophilus!' that made me quick in my boots." "So what about your mother?" asked Heron. "Fortunately, mother could be much more loving, and I remember some cuddles from her, but never in front of father. When he was present, she would be more severe with me, and this would make me feel guilty and anxious. I never knew what I was supposed to have done to cause her sudden change in attitude, but she had quite a sense of fun, and I remember her playing with me, especially dressing up and singing. Once father came in unexpectedly, and she stopped immediately. To this day I can still experience that same anxiety and guilt for no apparent reason." "And what about her parents?" asked Heron. "Do you remember them?" "It's funny you should ask me that," said Toad, with a little more animation than he had shown hitherto. "Her father, my maternal grandfather, had a very strong influence on my early life. He had been a fellow at college in Cambridge and then became a rector in a county parish nearby, where he became very involved in the mission to the South Seas. Rather to everyone's surprise, he was made a suffragan bishop of Blueberry and became quite famous for his preaching. I often think that I may have inherited a little of his skills of oratory." As the heron did not respond to this remark, Toad continued. "He was always referred to as the bishop, even by mother, although we very rarely saw him. But I remember once that he came to our church to preach a missionary sermon. Mother strongly supported his work, and we had any number of missionary boxes in our house shaped like straw huts, with a slot in the roof in which you could put your pennies. I was told that the money would help the bishop to start schools and hospitals in the South Seas, but more excitingly, the money would also help build a boat to sail around the islands." But what has this to do with the bishop's visit, which you remember? Asked Heron. I'm coming to that, said Toad. When the bishop came to preach his sermon, he gave us a tour in spirit of the whole boat, as yet unbuilt. He asked a blessing on every piston, spar, and stanchion, and at the end we sang, "For those in peril on the sea." I was so enthralled that I think that was where I got my lifelong love of boats and boating. What about your schooling? Asked Heron. Well, that's another matter, answered Toad. When I was 7, I was sent to prep school in Brighton, called Galleons, where I was deeply and continuously unhappy. Luckily the head was quite a decent sort, gentle and slightly shell-shocked from the war. On the whole we were not treated badly, but there was never enough food. But there were 2 things that I can remember to this day. What are they? Asked Heron. First, the loneliness and sadness of leaving home at the start of every term, and second, the excitement of coming home at the end of term, and then finding it all so disappointing and unwelcoming. At 13 I went to St. Endemans, a minor public school in Yorkshire, which was centred both structurally and organisationally around the school chapel. The school was founded on the principles of muscular Christianity, and this left me out of breath and out of sympathy. I never liked it and found team games agony. There were frequent references to the bishop, your grandfather, who I discovered was on the board of governors. It was made clear to me that he would not have been happy with much of my behaviour. So was it all pain and grief, Toad? Inquired the Heron. Oh, no, not at all, replied Toad with some vigour. I enjoyed singing in the choir, and one of my triumphs was taking the female lead in the end-of-term operetta. I started to play golf and got my handicap down to 12. But much more importantly, I discovered that I could make friends. I could always make people laugh, and, with father's allowance, I could also treat them at the tuck shop. I was known as good old Toady, and I liked that. Come to think of it, I still like it. Perhaps that is why I like Mole so much. Toad paused and thought for a minute. The Heron did not interrupt. Then Toad continued. I worked well enough to be able to stay on to the 6th form, which in many ways was where I began to find myself. That was where I first began to wear a bow tie, and I can still remember father's intense disapproval when I wore it at home. For the first time I felt real satisfaction at his reaction. If he was going to disapprove of me, I thought at least I would give him something to disapprove of. I've worn one ever since. He fiddled self-consciously with the dark blue polka-dot bow tie he was wearing. I also started a dining club at school called Puddings, and I was the founder president. We used to meet out of bounds in the neighbouring village, and this was the start of my lifelong interest in food and wine. I also started to get a reputation as a bit of a bohemian, and bought records of Stravinsky and Berg. I think some of the masters were quite impressed, but my taste has changed now. I prefer Schubert. If these somewhat surprising revelations affected Heron, he did not show it, other than by uncrossing and recrossing his long, thin legs. So then what happened? He asked. I went up to Cambridge. Somehow I managed to scrape through the Latin entrance exam and got one of the places allocated to my school. Initially they wanted me to read theology, imagine, but this was quickly changed to history, which I hated. So why did you agree? Asked the Heron. Oh, it's easy enough for you to talk, answered Toad peevishly, but all my life people have made decisions for me, can't you see that? Heron replied that he could not, but would Toad like to continue? Well, in spite of that, I really enjoyed myself at Cambridge. I met up with a crowd of fellows, perhaps not quite the friends my father would have wished, and we formed the Elean Poetry Society. Once a week we met in each other's rooms for breakfast and read out our poems and drank white burgundy. As well as this, I was always good at punting, and in the summer term it was all picnics and hampers up to Grantchester. What about your work? Asked Heron. I was just coming to that, said Toad, but it's a bit painful even now. Because of all these other activities, my academic work was suffering. To be honest, it was really non-existent. I constantly missed tutorials, and I would send round a charming note of apology to my tutor together with a bottle of vintage port. Nothing was ever said until my final term. What happened then? Asked Heron, leaning slightly forward in his chair. Well, said Toad, looking very uncomfortable, I have never told anyone this before. I was summoned to the master's study, and he read me the Riot Act. He said some things that were quite hurtful, to my mind unnecessary. Once again I was compared unfavourably to the bishop who, it turned out, had been a fellow at the college. But perhaps the unkindest cut of all was when the college chaplain, who had actually attended one of our alien breakfasts, sent me a note inviting me to ponder on a certain biblical text which I have never forgotten. What was it? Asked the Heron, now quite obviously interested. It was Daniel 5:27. It refers to Belshazzar's feast, and what the mystical hand wrote on the wall. Well, come on, said Heron, now very interested. What did it write? It wrote, Meeny, meeny, tekel and parsin. I knew this story from childhood, and we used to say that it meant eeny, meeny, treacle and parsnips, but I had forgotten its true meaning. Oh, come on, Toad, said Heron impatiently. What does it really mean? It means this, said Toad. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. There was a long pause, during which Toad fidgeted uncomfortably, and the Heron looked into the middle distance. Then Toad seemed more composed. Heron said, So what happened then? The last thing anyone in college wanted to see was an undergraduate fail his finals, so I was put on what was called a special course, and my final exams consisted of only one paper, The Life of Nelson. As I had a month to swat for this, I finally passed. My father was so surprised and pleased when I told him that I'd been awarded a special that he increased my allowance, but I knew that dark clouds were forming on the horizon and that the storm was about to break. Talking of breaks, said the Heron, I suggest that we take one now, and he left the room. Soon after, Toad heard the sound of running water, and the Heron reappeared. So where were we? Asked Heron. Ah, yes, I remember. The storm was about to break. Would you like to carry on, please? Well, what I was going to say was this, continued Toad. For a long time, Father had been dropping hints, not very subtly, that I should take over the brewery. The thought appalled me, all that smell and steam and having to start work at 7:30. I don't usually get up until 10. One minute he was persuading me that it was my duty to do it and that the business must remain in the family. This would make me feel very miserable and inadequate, and I would say that I didn't feel up to it. Then he would round on me, call me a waster, and say all manner of unpleasant things about me and my friends, and how the last thing I was capable of doing was managing a business. How did that make you feel? Inquired Heron. Well, what do you think? I felt very unhappy, and I used to spend a lot of time in the local hotel cocktail bar and get home the worst for wear. So what happened then? A Cambridge chum let me know that they were looking for a junior master at my old prep school in Brighton Galleons. I applied, and rather to my surprise, I got the job. I got on well with the boys, and I was supposed to teach them everything. But the school prided itself on a strong naval tradition, so my special knowledge of Nelson proved to be invaluable. In fact, I became quite popular, and to be honest, I enjoyed it. My nickname was the Odious Toad, but I think that was said affectionately. A man amongst boys and a boy amongst men, said Heron quietly. What was that? Asked Ted. Oh, nothing much, replied Heron. What happened then? Well, I was there for about a year, when out of the blue I got a telegram saying that Father had died from a heart attack, and that I was to return immediately. Apparently he had just sold the brewery, and I think the stress involved in this killed him. Mother, who had a whole heap of shares, went off to live with her sister in the West Country, and I find myself inheriting Toad Hall, and a great deal of money. So you felt happy? Asked the Heron. No, replied Toad vehemently. I felt very unhappy and very inadequate. Toad Hall is a very large place, with a banqueting hall and very extensive grounds. I suddenly found that I had to look after all of it, which included cooks, servants, and outside staff. In the evenings I would walk around the rooms, many of which I had never entered before, and felt very alone. But gradually I began to build up my life. I started to invite a few friends in for lunch. I hate eating on my own. Then I got very interested in boating and made friends with Rat, and then later with his friend the Mole. I found that other people started to invite me into their organizations. Perhaps it was simply that I was now Toad of Toad Hall, but I was invited to become the president of the village cricket club, and also the local British Legion. I was elected onto the parish council and became a church warden, just like my father. Father had set up the Toad Hall Housing Trust to provide housing for local people. I was one of the trustees, and all of the activities took up quite a few days and evenings every month. Gradually I found myself caught up in a network of civic and social relationships. So you felt that your life was becoming a little more purposeful? Asked Heron. A little, replied Toad. But when there wasn't much happening, the old feelings of sadness and isolation would come over me, and I would have a couple of bad days. So how did you react to these feelings? Asked Heron. I was always looking for something I could excel at, something that would make people look at me and say, Look at Toad, isn't he wonderful? First came boating. I bought some really fine skiffs and worked very hard. My ambition, which I have never told anyone before, was to enter for the Diamond Sculls at Henley, but somehow I never got any better. Even the ducks used to laugh at me. And then one day I woke up and thought, To hell with boating. I have never rowed again, until the other morning, that is. My boathouse is full of lovely boats that are rotting away. Then came caravanning. I had seen some pictures in a magazine, and I bought one of the best. It really was beautiful. A brand new gypsy caravan, painted canary yellow, picked out with green and red wheels, and it came fully fitted. I can see it in my mind's eye now. Little sleeping bunks, a little table that folded up against the wall, a cooking stove, lockers, bookshelves, even a bird cage with a bird in it, and pots, pans, jugs, and kettles of every size and variety. Toad stopped and sat with a faraway look on his face as he remembered these golden days. It so happened that on the day after it was delivered, my friend the rat came round for lunch with Mole, and they agreed to come with me on a wonderful holiday, or at least that's what I thought it would be. Oh dear me, sighed Toad, tears beginning to roll down his cheeks. If only I had known then what I know now. It all seemed so innocent and exciting at the time. It was like the world must have been before the fall. We were all little children again, or at least I was. It seemed that the church clock stood at 10 to 3, and there was honey still for tea. He paused. And then everything seemed to go wrong. Toad's voice trailed away into silence as he sat there sobbing and remembered how evil had entered his world. Heron remained silent. Eventually Toad wiped his eyes and sat up straighter. In a small voice he said to Heron, I suppose you know what happened to me after that? Yes, I do, replied Heron. I've read about it like everyone else. I'm afraid that part of your life is forever in the public domain. He paused and then said, Shall we stop there? I think that you have given me a full and detailed story of your life, and I hope you feel that because of this I can understand you better. Yes, I do, said Toad, who was beginning to cheer up a little. And to be honest, Heron, it's quite an interesting story, isn't it? It is extremely interesting, answered Heron. But the point is, what can you learn from it? And with that question, Heron closed the meeting and escorted Toad to the door. As he was about to leave, Heron said, By the way, Toad, whatever happened to the bird in the cage in your caravan after the accident? I've often wondered. Mole took it home and looked after it, Toad replied. As a matter of fact, he's still got it. Nice creature, Mole. And Toad walked down the path thinking that, for most of his life, he had felt as caged as that poor bird. Would he ever escape from his past and find freedom? He knew how Heron would answer that. He would say, That's a good question, Toad. What is your answer? How infuriating. But as he walked home, Toad started to work out his response.